Good evening. So many people just to see me. So officially welcome. I'm Harold Holzer. I have the privilege of serving as director of the Roosevelt House. And it's wonderful to see all of you here as I get the chance to welcome a friend and frankly a hero of mine, Bob Caro, the winner of countless prizes and honors, a man whose account of his working methods has achieved iconic status, not just his works, but his methods. It's sort of like a Julia Child recipe. You cannot vary from an ingredient, not after reading and hearing Bob talk about how he accomplishes the miraculous things he accomplishes. Working, which was supposed to be in front of me, but you've seen on screen, is his latest and his shortest book ever, hailed as iridescent and riveting, attracting attention not only from critics, but from the New York Times Magazine, the New York Times Style section, Conan O'Brien, right? I feel like having watched Conan interview Bob Caro, I've learned much, learned what to ask, what not to ask. And of course, what all of these interviews and the book itself reveal is that Robert Caro is the very model of a brilliant historian, not just because of his writing, but because of the way he attacks his projects. The fact that he is committed to dogged research, relentless inquiry, and a kind of visceral experience that he requires of himself and his work that is really unmatched in the field. And just to remind you, his first book, The Power Broker, continues to reign as a staple in urban policy courses all over the country, including Hunter College. It is still in print many years after its publication. It is listed as one of the great books of the 20th century, 45 years after. And it's no wonder that the fifth volume of his Lyndon Johnson trilogy oh, good, everyone got that. Well, Bob himself has called it a 3-volume book that is now 4 volumes and counting, is as eagerly awaited as, I don't know what to compare it to, Harper Lee's sequel to Kill a Mockingbird. J.D. Salinger's son just announced that he has manuscripts left. So what? We're waiting for Caro. So it's an honor to have you in the home of Governor, later President Franklin Roosevelt, who I guess among his other accomplishments as governor, he inherited Robert Moses, didn't he? Yeah. And you just came through. Bob was nervous because he was not late, but he was not as early as usual. Came through one of the Robert Moses projects that he did under the New Deal, the 65th Street Transverse, right? He forgot the drains. So how do you must know, but how did FDR and Robert Moses get along, did your research show?
Robert Moses and Lyndon Johnson, hatred is not too strong a word.
No, Moses and FDR.
Oh, Moses and FDR. Moses and FDR, hatred is not too strong a word.
I didn't have to reset the question. Did FDR think Smith had given him too much power from the outset?
Well, they started out as being rivals for Al Smith's affections and patronage. They were both young men. They both were interested in parks. You know, Roosevelt designed park pulling off spots along the Taconic Parkway, and he envisioned himself as a park man early on, and Robert Moses was, of course, creating parks on Long Island. So for a time, they were rivals for who was going to be head of the New York State Park Commission.
Oh. I didn't know about FDR and the Taconic.
Well, they were two people who didn't like to lose.
Yeah.
And in this case, Moses beat him, you know.
That's amazing. And of course, I mean, we do have to give a nod to both Moses and FDR because among the WPA and PWA projects is not only the transverse that creates traffic and mess right in front of Roosevelt, in front of FDR's own house, Bud Hunter College. FDR did get the Works Progress Administration to build the new Hunter. So we forgive a lot here. So let's tackle working. That's what we're here to talk about, which is an account of why and how it takes a long time for you to research and write your books. And some of your chapters are like gripping little mystery stories as you unravel situations and events and interviews that you talk about. What was your original inspiration for your work ethic? Did you get that at home? I mean, were your parents hardworking people, and did that inspire you?
Well, my mother died when I was quite young, and my father was very elderly when he had me, so I don't think anything came from being at home. You're complimenting me by saying I have a work ethic. I'm taking that as a compliment.
It is.
It could be a lazy work ethic, but I don't really know. I just always, from the first time I started going through files, you know, as an investigative reporter, I just sort of loved doing it. And there's also, whatever it is, you know, I'm not comfortable writing. When I was a reporter, I remember I couldn't stand having to write a story when there were still questions I had to ask. But of course, as a newspaper reporter, you had to write the story. And when I quit to do the Power Broker, I remember saying to myself, I'm not going to write this until as long as I have a question that I still want to ask.
So daily deadlines were not your cup of tea.
I was constantly fighting with my editors.
I'm still going to stay a little bit with the early Bob Caro. What were you like as a Horace Mann or a Princeton student? Were you facile, or did you take a long time to hand in your term papers? I'm just curious.
Yes. In fact, I met my wife when I was a senior at Princeton, and with about a week to go, I hadn't done my senior thesis, and Princeton had a really hard deadline then. You either had to deliver it properly bound to the English department office by 5 o'clock on this Friday, or you couldn't hand in your thesis. And I had this lady that I then considered an elderly lady. She was probably about 40, and she was my typist. So I had a car, which I didn't. So I would type, and every 3 or 4 pages I'd hand them to Ina, and she'd run them down to this elderly lady, and the elderly lady would type it. And we made her stay up all night, the night before, to get my...
So all three of you stayed up all night getting your paper in?
Yeah.
But that's in character, so that's good.
It is in character. Unfortunately, it is in character.
So you weren't, but didn't you say in the book, and I know we've talked about a lot of this stuff also ourselves, didn't you say that you had a teacher at Princeton who thought that you were too facile? Yes. A teacher who made Professor Blackmer, right?
Yes. Well, that was a, you know, we all have moments in our life which we remember because someone has said something that you can't forget. I had a creative writing teacher named R.P. Blackmer. At the time, he was a very famous critic. Now he's completely forgotten. Very soft-spoken, courtly Southern gentleman. And I took his course for 2 years. So every 2 weeks, you would have to hand in a short story. So I did this, and I always got pretty good marks from him. So I thought I was fooling him about the fact that I did everything at the very last minute. I was always what we used to call pulling an all-nighter to get it done in time, but I didn't think he knew that, and I always got pretty good marks. So then the last session I had with him, I had handed in a short story, and he gave it back to me with some complimentary remark, and I was getting up to go, and he said, "But you know, Mr. Caro, you're never going to achieve what you want to unless you learn to stop thinking with your fingers." And, you know, I realized in that moment he had seen right through me all along. He knew I wasn't putting any work into this, any real thinking, just writing, because writing always came easily to me. So when I quit to do The Power Broker, I said, I'm going to make myself, then I was a newspaper man, and I was the fastest rewrite man, I think, on Newsday. You know, you'd sit there with a headset, if there was a plane crash or something, and all the reporters would be calling in the information, and you'd sit there writing one lead after another. But when I decided to write The Power Broker, and I realized how complicated this book was going to have to be, I remember thinking to myself, I'm going to do something to make myself slow down. And that's really why I write my first drafts in longhand, because writing things in longhand is really the slowest way of committing your thoughts to paper.
You know, Roosevelt House just acquired 15 or 16 handwritten letters to President Roosevelt from Daisy Suckley.
Oh.
And I got a call today from the New York Times asking about the letters and saying, why do you think he wrote in longhand? And I thought, because he didn't tweet. And that in fact, writing by hand allows you to consider your thoughts and express yourself cautiously. It's the opposite of emailing or tweeting or writing on a computer. Yeah. And you don't use a computer except to compile research to this day, right?
That's right.
Still do the longhand drafts?
I do the first 3 or 4 drafts in longhand, and then I switch to a typewriter, Smith Corona Electra 210.
Do your fans still send you their spare parts so you can have them?
Well, every time you have a book come out, they do profiles on you. They will mention that I use this particular model of typewriter. So you get 2 kinds of letters. The first kind of letter says, oh, I have one in my garage. I haven't used it for years. I'm sending it to you. The second kind of letter says, oh, I have one in my garage. I haven't used it for years. I'll sell it to you for $4,000. So I answer all the first ones, and I build up. But you have to build up a stockpile, because if a part breaks, you have to cannibalize another machine, because they stopped making them like 30 years ago.
I remember when I stopped using slide projectors for lectures because they didn't repair them anymore. So I have a lot of slides and no spare parts. So I'm still questing for some more of the, Professor Blackmer is a fascinating story, but there was also this man named Alan Hathaway, right, who was one of your editors, and he gave you the advice that you've carried for a lifetime of research. So
well, those of you who have read the book will have read this already, but I'll just... So when I went to work on Newsday, I was literally the first Ivy League graduate who had ever been hired for the Newsday City Room, because the managing editor was this old guy who was really, it's a cliche to say it, but out of the front page. He was a huge guy with a... He used to wear, he had broad shoulders and a big style. He used to wear black shirts with yellow ties and brown shirts with white ties. He had this big head with just a little monk's tonsure around the back. The head was very red, and it would get redder during the day because he drank a lot. And we never actually knew, it was a secret, whether Alan had ever graduated from or even attended a college. But he really had a prejudice against prestigious universities. So no one, they had never hired anyone from an Ivy League school. I was hired by his deputy while he was on vacation as a joke on him. But he didn't think it was so funny, and he wouldn't talk to me. So as it happens, my desk was on the way to his office from the front. So I'd say, hello, Mr. Hathaway. Hi, Mr. Hathaway. He'd never acknowledge it. But the following thing happened. So Newsday then didn't have a Sunday edition. So the low reporter on the totem pole, who is me, worked Saturday afternoon and Saturday nights, because if a story came in, you just did a memo for the real reporters who would write the story on Sunday night for the Monday paper. So I was all alone in the city room one Saturday, and the phone rings. Newsday was on this crusade. the Federal Aviation, the Air Force had just given up this huge base in the middle of Nassau County called Mitchell Field. It was 1,200 acres. And the corporations on Long Island wanted it converted into a private airport so that the company officials could fly in and out on their planes. But Newsday wanted it used for educational purposes to provide a campus for Nassau Community College. So this, the FAA, the phone rings, and it's this official from the FAA, and he says, you know, I like what you guys are doing, and I know what files you should be looking in. And if you send someone down here, I'll let him in and give him the files he should be looking at. So I called, and it was the day of the Newsday picnic, so everybody was on the beach at Fire Island. Of course, there weren't cell phones then, so no one could get in touch with anybody. And I got a hold of this editor, and he kept calling, and he couldn't get in touch with anyone. Finally, he said, you'll have to go yourself. So this was a moment like Professor Blackmore. Days of things that happen that you remember all your life. So I drove down there, and he met me at the door and led me into this room with a big conference table, and there was stacks of file folders on it, and he left me there. It was the first time I had ever gone through files, raw files. And I remember I just loved doing it, and I lost track of time. I remember the next morning when I came out, the sun was up. I had worked all night, and I hadn't even thought of that. And I went back, I wrote this memo, and I went home. Ina and I hadn't moved from New Jersey yet. So early Monday morning, Alan Hathaway's secretary, a woman named June Lum, calls and says, Alan wants to see you right away. And I said something like, well, I'm in New Jersey. And she said, well, Alan wants to see you right away. And I said to Ina, see, I was right not to move. I'm about to get fired. And I drove all the way there, sure, every mile of the way that I was about to be fired. I go in, and June waves me over to go into Alan's office, and I walk, and his office was glass enclosed. So I see this huge red head bent over something, reading, and I get to the doorway, and I'm just standing there, and after a while he notices me, and he says, come in. I came in and sit down. He keeps reading. I see what he's reading is my memo. And finally he looks up and he says, I didn't know someone from Princeton could do digging like this. From now on, you do investigative work. I also remember that with my usual savoir-faire at moments like this, I said, but I don't know anything about investigative work. So Alan said, but and these are words, again, you're hitting on words that I remember all my life. Just remember one thing. Turn every page. Never assume anything. Turn every goddamn page. And really, those words stuck with me all my life.
Literally.
Literally.
Yeah. Didn't he also give you this astonishing advice, sort of a director's instructions on how to conduct an interview? That people on good cop, bad cop stuff. Tell us about that.
Alan was out on the front page. We had to get information from some guy who really didn't want to give us the information. So he called me in with another reporter, a great investigative reporter named Bob Green. He said, now when you talk to this guy, don't sit close together. Carol, you sit over there. Green, you sit over there, and fire those questions at him as fast as you can. I want his head going back and forth with it like a ping pong ball. On another occasion, I remember, there was this guy who was refusing to talk to me, and I went in and told Alan this guy wouldn't give me an appointment. And Alan said, call him back and tell him if he doesn't see you, he's going to be eating his meals off a tin tray for the next 10 years. So that was the kind of advice he gave you. But there was also...
Those are the little pieces of advice you didn't feel you had to follow for your entire career.
Well, I did my best.
You're a persistent interviewer, but you don't play tricks, right? Or do you?
No, I really don't.
So how did you go from covering Moses, the Rye Oyster Bay Bridge, things like that? I remember I traveled to Albany with Bob Caro a few years ago for a Q&A. I'll tell you two interesting things. One is that Bob said he we could go in the same car. And I didn't know him then as well as I know now. And I thought, well, this is going to be an exciting opportunity. I'm going to get to spend 2.5 hours on the New York Thruway with Robert Caro and get to talk and learn about his secrets and what he does that I should emulate. Turn Every Page is a good example, by the way. So we got in the car. Bob opens up a briefcase, and he has long galleys in them. And I said, what are those? He said that these are the galleys of my 4th volume of Lyndon Johnson, so I really will not be able to talk to you on the way up. Each page, which is in type, was covered with handwritten emendations and fixes. And I said, oh, one thing I did get to say before he cut off communication altogether was, you know, when I do galleys on one of my books, I can only do like 3 per page or make sure the paragraph doesn't change because they don't. And he said, well, I have a different agreement with my publisher. Why? Oh, so when we got to Albany, there was actually an exhibit in the LCA room, which is the press room in Albany on the 3rd floor of the state capitol, of Bob's books and articles, and we went to see it. And so you're revered among the journalists who cover Albany.
Well, nice of you to say so.
And so you were covering Moses. How did you decide, and when, do you remember, to transition between reporting and undertaking this book, which was an audacious thing to do?
Well, it came in stages, you know. I was an investigative reporter. I'd become an investigative reporter in the way that I told you. I was getting more and more interested in political power. And I had won a couple of minor, really, believe me, minor journalistic awards. But when you win something, no matter how minor it is, when you're young, you think you know everything. So I thought I really understood how political power worked. And then Robert Moses decided he wanted to build this bridge between Oyster Bay and Rye, you know, over Long Island Sound. So he had built the Triborough Bridge, the Bronx Whitestone Bridge, the Throgs Neck Bridge. Now he wanted to build one from between Rye and Oyster Bay. And Newsday assigned me to look into this, and I really found this was one of the world's really bad ideas, because among other things, the traffic that it would have generated coming down from New England would have, as I recall, required 8 lanes more lanes on the Long Island Expressway just to hold that traffic. And the bridge would have had to be so big that the piers that it stood on would have caused pollution in Long Island Sound. So I wrote a series of articles, as I remember, on this bridge. And Newsday sent me to Albany, and I saw Governor Rockefeller, and I saw Governor Rockefeller's counsel, and the Speaker of the State Assembly, and the President of the State Senate. Everybody understood this is one of the world's really terrible ideas. And I wrote a story basically saying that the bridge was dead, and went back to whatever other assignments I had. So I had a friend in Albany then, and about 2 weeks later, he calls me and he says, Bob, I think you better come back up to Albany. And I said, he said, Bob Moses was up here yesterday. Robert Moses was up here yesterday. I think you better come back to Albany. I said, oh, I don't think I have to do that. I think I took care of that bridge. And he says, Bob, Robert Moses was up here yesterday. I think you ought to come back. So I came back and I saw Governor Rockefeller and Governor Rockefeller's counsel and the Speaker of the Assembly and the President of the State Senate. And they all thought this was the world's greatest idea. And not only that, the state had already agreed to fund the beginning of it. So that was another moment. You're pinpointing things that I remember because they were turning points in my life. I remember all the way driving back from Albany to our home in Roslyn, Long Island, was 163 miles. And every one of those miles, I remember thinking, everything you've been writing that you've been so proud of is really baloney, because everything you do has the underlying belief that we live in a democracy, and therefore power comes from elections, from the votes we cast at a ballot box. Here was a guy, Robert Moses, who was never elected to anything. And he had more power than anyone who was elected, more power than any mayor, more power than any governor, more power than any mayor and governor put together. And he had held this power for 44 years, almost half a century. And with it, he had shaped the whole landscape that we live. And I said, and you don't have any idea where he got this power, and neither does anybody else. So I can't remember the question that started this.
Well, you had to drive the stake into the bridge again.
Well, no, not really.
It's not there.
It's only there because Nelson, at the end, you know, this is something I actually haven't included this in any of my books, and I was thinking about it the other night, and I said I'd never explain this to people. So the only reason Robert Moses ever lost power, after he had arranged things so that no governor could remove him and no mayor could remove him, and the reason was that his power was incorporated in the bond covenants that the Triborough Bridge Authority issued. And bond covenants are contracts, and the Constitution of the United States says no state shall abridge a contract. So they couldn't be changed. It didn't matter what the legislature did, unless the bondholders agreed to whatever proposal Moses, and he thought this would never happen. He overlooked the only eventuality that could have resulted in his removal from power, that the governor would be named Nelson Rockefeller, and the governor would have a brother named David Rockefeller, who was the president of the Chase Manhattan Bank, which was the bondholder. And that coincidence was the only thing that allowed him to be removed from power, and that's the only thing that stopped that bridge.
It's amazing. But you determine to give up again, I'm saluting your courage. You decide you've made this progression from New Jersey newspaperman to Long Island newspaperman. You've invested in a house. Now you've moved so you don't have to commute. But you decide it's time to write the book about Robert Moses and the power he's accrued and won't release. So it gets to the point where Ina sells the house, right?
Yes.
To fund the enterprise.
Yes.
And she does tell you that she wishes you would write about France instead of the Bronx. But you moved to the Bronx, right? Because that's where Moses had.
No, we moved to the Bronx because it was the cheapest place to get an apartment.
I don't think that's clear in the book, so I'm glad you clarified that. But it was an enormous risk, was it not, to do this, especially since you're now literally turning every page. And a great tribute to your perspicacity and diligence and devotion to this task. So I know you had one or more than one encounter with Moses himself.
Yes.
How did he treat you?
Well, he wouldn't see me for, when a lot of people had, many writers, including some famous writers, had started to do a biography of him, but not one had ever finished. And I suppose they were all sort of told. So one day I was called by his public relations team, Edward V. O'Brien and Murray Davis, to take me out to lunch. And they said, I suppose they had said to other biographers what they said to me, that Commissioner Moses, that's how they all referred to him, Commissioner Moses won't ever talk to you, and his family won't ever talk to you, and his friends won't ever talk to you. Then they had another line, the wording of which I can never exactly remember, but it was to the purport of, nobody who ever wants a contract from the state or city again will ever talk to you. But so I decided to do the following thing. I drew a series of concentric circles on a page. I put a dot in the center. The dot was Robert Moses. So I said, I'm sure he can keep the innermost circles, his family and his close friends, from talking to me, but I don't think he can remember everybody in the outer circles or even think of them, people who encountered him at one point or another. I'll start with them. And after about 2 years, suddenly out of nowhere, his daughter Jane called me and said, she called him Papa Bear. She said, Papa Bear will see you. So I had my first interview with him. That was quite an experience. It was out, if you go to Jones Beach, beyond Jones Beach is a little summer community called Oak Beach. And Robert Moses had for some years been renting the last cottage in the corner. And he had torn out 2 whole walls of the living room and replaced them just with glass. So what you saw out the left-hand wall was the Robert Moses Bridge, the Robert Moses Causeway to Long Island. What you saw out the right-hand window was the tower of Robert Moses State Park. So he sat in the corner there in this very large black chair and talked to you, surrounded by his monuments. And it was great talking to him. He really taught me something. He remembered, all the practice. He forgot nothing. He'd say something like, I asked him about some vote on Jones Beach. He'd say, well, it was 8. He'd say, I can't imitate him. He said, it was 8-7 against us in Assembly Ways and Means, but the swing vote was Stevens of Cattaraugus County, and Stevens had a farm. The mortgage on the farm was held by the Rochester First State City Bank, and the way to get to the Rochester First State City Bank was through so-and-so. So it became 8-7. But he could also jump up, and particularly he had 12 offices, so later I would be interviewing him in his offices. In each office, he had a giant map of New York City and the surrounding areas. And he'd get so excited, like a little boy. He always liked to use these long yellow pencils that some of you may be old enough to remember that had an eraser on the end. And so, he always had staff members sitting behind him when he talked. So he'd go like this, and someone would slap a pencil. And he'd stand up in front of the mat, and he'd say, we ought to put he was talking about a connection between one highway and another. He says, we'll put it here. Can't you see if we put it here, we can have the parks over here, and then we'll put the housing there. He was a little boy, and I remember thinking, this is a different kind of genius. I've never heard anything like this. We think of genius in the terms we're taught about it in school, that it's Picasso in front of a canvas, or a Beethoven or a Mozart in front of a music manuscript. But this is the genius of a city shaper, a guy who sees a whole huge metropolitan area as one picture and is filling in lines on it for all his life. I said, I have to try to show that kind of genius as well. But, I have to say, I only saw him 7 times. And I asked the wrong question on the 7th interview, and that was the last time I ever saw him.
7 times is amazing, considering he had never seen anybody
Yes.
before. He clearly took you very seriously.
Right.
So, by the way, even though this is allegedly a book about process, you write about Moses's building of the Northern State Parkway in this book, and remember the farmers he displaced when the North Shore had farms. That is heartbreaking, and the emotion that comes out of your work is what sets you apart. I love those stories. And you tell us what you discovered through research and inquiry. The long, mysterious story is worth repeating. Why do we have to go to 125th Street to get on the Triborough Bridge, which crosses the river at 98th Street? Do you want to just tell us that?
That
quick?
can be told very simply. They had been wanting to build the Triborough Bridge, and they couldn't get it built. And one reason was they didn't have any support in the press. William Randolph Hearst owned 3 powerful New York City newspapers then. It was 1934. Robert Moses takes over the Triborough Bridge Authority, and he sees that William Randolph Hearst owns a group of tenements at 125th Street, as I recall, between 2nd and 3rd Avenue. And they had been profitable before the Depression, but now it was the Depression, and low-income people didn't have money to pay the rents, and he wanted the city to take them off his hands through eminent domain and for some project. And Moses sees the project can be the Triborough Bridge. So now it's at 125th Street, and he got the bridge built.
It's an amazing story. I have to tell you that this won't be a question. I just will tell you an anecdote that I've yet to tell you. Someone wrote to me after hearing that you were going to speak at Roosevelt House, to say that he was in a class group that went to Robert Moses's office after your book came out. And we know that, as you relate to us in the book, he wrote a formal statement, a long statement. But someone in the class said, "What about this Caro book that just came out?" And he was taken aback. And he said, "Caro is finished in this town." He said he will never work again. And did you hear? This is a true story. I'll give you the email later. And did you hear his wife is leaving him?
My wife?
Yeah, your wife. Not his wife, your wife. So a few years later, she's here. By the way, Ina gets the best lines in this book. When you renegotiated your Moses book, and Ina says, "Now I can go to the dry cleaners again." That's
Yes.
that's a great line. She does the short one-liners, and Bob does the long books. So I do want to spend some time with LBJ. Was he the only figure that represented on a national scale the accumulation of power that Moses represented on a regional scale? Because the curiosity we have is, why did you turn, of all the subjects you might have turned to, why LBJ?
Oh, that's a good question. But, I don't think of my books, as I've said a number of times, as biographies. I think of them as studies in political power. And I realized when I was doing the Power Broker that if you picked the right man, you could show a lot about political power. But you had to pick the right man. And the key thing was it had to be a man who did something that no one else had ever done. Because therefore, if you could figure out how he did it, you would be showing something about the realities of power, not what we learn in textbooks, but what really happened. So Moses, of course, did something that no one else had ever done. He was never elected to anything, but he got all this power and held it for almost half a century. So all the time I was doing the power, as I realized this, I said, I never thought, we were broke most of this time, and I never thought that I'd get to do another book. But I remember thinking, gee, if I ever could do another one, I'd like to do national power. Moses is urban power in cities. I'd like to do national power, and I'd like to do Lyndon Johnson. What attracted me to Johnson was not his presidency, but his Senate majority leadership. Johnson becomes Senate Majority Leader in January 1955. At that point, so in the 1850s, the Senate had Webster, Clay, and Calhoun, etc. But for a century after that, between them and 1955, the Senate was basically the same dysfunctional mess that it is today. And then Johnson becomes Majority Leader in January 55, and he stays for 6 years. For 6 years, the Senate is the center of governmental creativity and ingenuity and energy in Washington. It's not Dwight Eisenhower's civil rights bill, it's Lyndon Johnson's civil rights bill. He leaves to become Senator Kennedy's vice president. And it's quite remarkable. Within a month after he leaves, all the newspapers are writing the Senate is back to being a mess again. And I think it's sort of stayed that way to this day. So you say this is the only individual who made the Senate work in the last 2.5 centuries. How did he do it? If I could show that, if I could find out how he did it, I had no idea how he did it, and show that, I'd be adding something to our understanding of political power.
And was your first stop the LBJ Library?
Yeah, unfortunately it was.
Well, now when people go, they get to see a video with you in it. So
Yes.
Edith and I did that. So tell us about confronting the pages you would have to turn in this project.
Well, when you come into the library, you're faced with a wall 4 stories high. Each of those stories, you see rows of boxes. In fact, there are 175 boxes across, and I think there are 3 lines of them. And they go back as far as you can see. And they told me at the time there were, I forget the number, but there were they contained 32 million pieces of paper. Now they're up to 45 million pieces of paper. So I realized Alan Hathaway's advice to turn every page wasn't going to work here.
So, and it would be physically impossible even to open every box.
Oh, sure.
So how did the man who turned every page choose which boxes to open and which pages to turn?
Oh,
It must have been painful in a way.
yeah, it was really, it was really hard. You know, you zero in on things. Like I wanted to show what it was like, what the life of a young congressman was like. So I thought I'd take the first 3 years of Lyndon Johnson's, when he came to Washington in 1937, he was 29 years old. I said, I'll look at those boxes. Those, as I recall, that was just like 6 boxes or something. That's 4,800 pages. But as you turn every page, you find these, just as Alan said, you find things you never dreamed you'd find.
But what sets Bob Caro apart, I think, is not only the research which he did with Ina for all those months in the library, and then we can talk about some of the other the on-site work, but if Bob reads about something, for example, LBJ walked really quickly from his boarding house to the Capitol, he won't be satisfied until he figures out why he walked. And one of my favorite parts in the book is you recreating Johnson's path, still not getting it, and then what did you do? You changed the hour, right?
Well, you got one word wrong. He didn't walk, he ran.
I know. I wanted you to say that.
What was so interesting was I found when he came to Washington when he was 23, so he was what they used to call a secretary to a congressman. So I found the woman who worked in the office with him. Her name was Estelle Harbin. She was from San Antonio, a ranch outside San Antonio. And she told me this story. So Johnson then lived in this little hotel down by Union Station. So he would be coming up, walk up the hill, and then Estelle Harbin lived in a boarding house behind the Library of Congress. So she'd be coming this way. If he was coming this way, I gesture, you can't hear me anymore. And she said, you know, the thing that got me is he'd be walking up the hill, and every morning as he got in front of the Capitol, he'd suddenly start running in a very excited way, and he'd run the whole way in front of the Capitol. And she said, first, I remember she said, first I thought he was cold because it was winter and he was very poor and he only had a thin summer top coat. But then she said, you know, then it turned to spring, and he still, every morning I'd be coming here and I'd see him break into this run as if he was very excited and run. And I couldn't figure out, I said, oh, what is capturing his imagination? What is getting him so excited? So I did go back, as you say, over and over again, and I never saw anything. You know, there's the Capitol. It's as it happens, you know, the Capitol is 750 feet long, and it's filled with, you know, it's columns and pediments with heroic figures. But that's what it is. What was getting him excited? The one thing I forgot, that I had never done it at the time that Lyndon Johnson did it. They were both, Estelle and Lyndon, were ranch kids, so they got up with the sun. So he'd be doing this walk and run at 5:30 or 6 o'clock in the morning. So finally I went back, and the first time I went, at whatever time that was, 5:30, I said, oh, I get it. Because what happens is, that's the east front of the Capitol that Lyndon Johnson is in front of. The sun comes up in the east. So at that moment, the sun is hitting that whole 750 feet of gleaming white marble and lighting it up like some thrilling. So I said, of course, this is a guy who grew up in a little log cabin, and he came from a country of little log cabin, dog-run cabins, they call them. All of a sudden, there it is. It's like this is the power of America, the sovereign state of government. This is what you can have if you succeed here. Of course he was excited. So that was what happened there.
So this is, again, this is beyond research. This is living the experience. As when you wrote about, I don't think this was in the book, but I've read this, that when Bob was writing about the negotiations to make Johnson vice president, with Robert Kennedy going between the suites in the hotel, which is a great story. That's not good enough for Robert Caro. You went to the stairwell, and you went back and forth a few times
Yeah,
between
but I
floors.
didn't find anything interesting.
But you ran up and down the stairwell,
I did.
hoping for the sun to break out on the east. It's an amazing story. So but just these little tidbits are what make this book so revelatory. And for someone who does a lot of research, to hear about these miracles that happen, and they're not miracles of chance. They're miracles that result from diligence and really hard work and determination. You were not satisfied that Lyndon Johnson's school yearbook had nothing disagreeable about him until you found a whole. Tell the story. I don't want to give too much of it away.
Well,
it's a fabulous story.
So there were 7 previous biographies of Lyndon Johnson had been written. I'm going to try to make this shorter than my usual story. I may not succeed, but and they all portrayed him as sort of this Horatio Alger figure from the Hill Country, a popular, charismatic young man whom everybody loved at college and all. But when I started doing interviews with the people who went to college with him, I realized I was getting such a different picture. I really thought at the beginning that they were all exaggerating or jealous of him, and I really wasn't usually typing up my notes because I didn't trust the interviews. But I was trying to find as many living classmates as I could, and I came across a woman named Ellis Sorrell. So she was a teacher, a first and second grade teacher in Houston, and she addressed me, I remember in this call, as if I was a first or second grader. And she had been called before about Lyndon Johnson, and so I was asking her about some of these anecdotes, unpleasant anecdotes that I was being told, and she said something like, "I don't know why you're asking me all these questions. It's all there in black and white." I hear her question, and it's all there in black and white. I said, "Where is it in black and white?" And she says, "It's all in the yearbook." Well, I, of course, had looked through the yearbook, gone through it several times. I said, "Where is it in the yearbook? I hadn't seen anything like that." I said, "Would you mind getting your yearbook?" She's really annoyed at me now. But I get her to go get the yearbook, and she says, she's leafing through it, and she's pages 235, 238. I could be excused because it was a very thick yearbook, with all the pages of ads from the merchants. So as soon as I got back to my house, I looked through, and I turned to whatever the 230, there was no 235, there was no 238. And then I saw that these pages had been cut out as if with a razor so neatly right at the whatever you call that, at the spine of the book, that you wouldn't really see it. So Ina and I went to a lot of used bookstores, and we got other copies of the yearbook, and these pages were all missing, except finally there was one that we found, and of course that contains the material that really documents in black and white what his college classmates thought of Lyndon Johnson. There are pages there on how he stole elections to control the student council.
Student council election.
Pardon me?
Student council election.
Student council election. There are pages there which talk about his nickname on campus, which was Bull Johnson, which means exactly what you think it meant. And it says master of bullshit, actually. He got an MB degree, so all these things are there. And I think, it's very interesting. You're taking me back through a lot of the stuff you say. What kind of a human being, I remember saying, what kind of a human being am I dealing with here, who at the age of 21 thinks enough about his role in history or posterity to have the pages he missed. He missed some, but to have from hundreds of copies of his college yearbook pages cut out. A remarkable human being
with a vision of where he would be.
With a vision of where he would be. He was working on a highway gang when he was in college. to earn money. And, it was a horrible, he was really in harness with the mules, because the way they built highways then was they didn't have machinery, of course. We're talking about 1919, 1920. The gangs would work with what they called a Fresno. A Fresno is a huge, big slab of steel, and they'd sharpen one end of it, and then they'd solder two handles on and reins and attach it to two mules. And the mules, they weren't paved roads, but to grave them, the guy would stand between the handles and push the Fresno while the mules pulled it. Imagine how hard this is to level the road. And because you have two hands and two handles, you don't have a hand free for the reins. So you'd tie the reins behind your back, the driver would. So as I wrote, Lyndon Johnson would be in harness with the mules for hours a day under the really blazing hill country sun in wintry weather. But at lunch hours, when they were all sitting around having their sandwiches, he would say, I'm going to be president of the United States one day. He always had this same vision, going back to the time he was a boy.
So among the other experience-driven research you did was that you and Ina, quintessential Easterners, moved to the hill country and lived there. For how long were you there?
Well, so you didn't quite quote. So I said to Ina, we're going to have to go to the hill country and live there for a while. And Ina said, why can't you do a biography of Napoleon?
Right.
But of course,
I
Ina
misquoted it earlier.
But of course, Ina said, as she always says, sure. And Ina, of course, was the key to doing the research there.
And again, it's not just the papers, although the papers are important to you always, and to us because of what you do with them, interpretively and statistically even. But you understood that your hands were not calloused enough for the local women to identify with you, and until you understood what it meant to be in the pre-Johnson era in the hill country and the post-Johnson era, not only because he brought the light, as you once said, but because of the washing regimen that you unearthed. Tell us about that.
It's a land of incredible loneliness. You can't even, if you're from New York like I was, you say, you can't even understand this loneliness. You'd call someone and they'd say you could come for an interview. So let's say it's a woman. Awful lot of widows in the hill country. So the directions would be something like you drive 47 miles out of Austin, and then you look for the cattle guard. You turn left, and you go 30 miles on this track, and you do that, and the 30 miles are unpaved and not a road, and you realize I haven't passed a house in 30 miles. So who did this person talk to before telephones? And even what was her life like? So, you kept hearing things you couldn't get my mind as a city boy around. Like Lyndon Johnson's brother told me once. So Lyndon Johnson didn't even live in Johnson City, which had 363 people in the middle of nowhere. He lived on the Johnson Ranch, which was 18 miles further into the hills. And so his brother, Sam Houston Johnson, told me how he and Lyndon would come down one corner of the ranch, came down next to what they called the Austin-Fredericksburg Highway, which was really an unpaved road between Austin and Fredericksburg. And they'd sit there for hours hoping that one rider and carriage would come along so they'd have someone new to talk to. So you really felt there's a poverty here that I can't understand. There was no cash in Johnson City. You could get a dime for a dozen eggs, but you had to sell them in Marble Falls. So Marble Falls is 23 miles away. And a friend of Lyndon Johnson's, a guy named Ben Kreider, told me how on market day, Saturdays, he would ride the 23 miles carrying a dozen eggs out like this in a box so that they wouldn't break. Yeah, you couldn't even grasp their lives.
You conducted some extraordinary interviews in this process, including LBJ's brother, which you've written about, and sort of got him to talk about his brother in a way that no one else had. But you also had what you describe as the most discomforting interview of your career with Lady Bird. Can you tell us just briefly, or you don't have to be brief, tell us about the Lady Bird Johnson interview.
I'll be as brief as I can.
Okay.
Look, so Lyndon Johnson had, how can I say? So Lady Bird was being very helpful to me. We would see each Saturday. She would spend a large part of the day with me. What she would do, she'd take out her, they used to have these big desk calendars. I don't think anyone here is old enough to remember them. And she'd say, she'd go through a year, let's say 1940, and she says, we had dinner with Sam Rayburn at Hall's Restaurant. I remember that dinner, and then she'd tell what they talked about. So Lyndon Johnson had any number of what we could call one-night stands or whatever, but I wasn't going to talk about them very much because they didn't have any relation to his political or life. But he had one affair, which those of you who have read the book know about, which lasted probably from the time he came to Congress as a young congressman. They met in 1937 or 38, and really lasted all through as far as, I think the sexual part ended after 2 or 3 years, but they were very close all the rest of his life. And even when he was vice president, he would drive down to her home, so in Virginia. And she was important because, among other things, she had a political mind. Her name was Alice Glass. And she had a political mind that people in Texas, politicians, felt she was worth listening to on everything. And there are a couple of times, turning points in Johnson's life, where it is her advice that he takes over everybody else's, like this one. See, this is getting longer already, isn't it? He's in Australia during the war, so you're allowed one telephone call back. It's 1942. The senior senator from Texas has just died. So he has to decide whether he's going to run for the Senate or to run again for the House of Representatives. Now, Franklin Roosevelt, who regarded Johnson as he was fond of Johnson as a real protege. It's your Franklin Roosevelt. Had told Johnson when he went in the Navy, if you need anything, you can call the White House. So you're allowed one telephone call from Australia. He doesn't call the White House. I didn't know anything about this, but as I'm going through these boxes, really turning pages, there's this telegram signed Alice. And it says, everyone else, by which I found out it meant the White House, thinks you should run for the Senate. I think you should run for the House again. Love, Alice. I didn't at the time know who Alice even was. But as it turns out, Johnson took her advice. It's one of several crucial times in his life when he only relied on her, well, not only, but when her advice was pivotal. And I gradually learned about her, quite a remarkable woman, who grew up, she was a small town girl who grew up in a town called Marlin. So Ina and I started going up to Marlin to interview people. Now, you would never go to Marlin for any other reason but to find out about Alice Glass. It's a little grubby town in the middle of nowhere. You go up to Waco and turn right, and you drive all day, and eventually you get to Marlin. So one day, we have a mutual friend who lives in Marlin. I'm making this as short as I can.
No, I want to just have time for
and he calls and he says, Bird. Everyone in Texas calls Lady Bird Bird. Bird knows been coming to Marlin, so she knows you know about Alice. So I said, well, there's nothing I can do about that. But then on Friday, her secretary appears at my desk and says, Mrs. Johnson would like to see you out at the ranch this Saturday. We've been talking in the office. And the incident that Harold is talking about, so I get out there and we immediately go into lunch. And she's sitting at the head of the table, and I'm sitting at her right hand with my notebook down to my right. And she starts, without a word of preamble, to talk about Alice Glass and to tell me how beautiful she was, how sophisticated she was, how elegant she was, how she gave Lyndon Johnson advice on things, and whatever she told Lyndon Johnson, he followed for the rest of his life. I'm sitting there, and what you're talking, wrote in in Working, that's the only interview I ever had where I couldn't bring myself to look at the person I was interviewing. And at the end of it, she said, well, that'll be enough for today. And the next week, we went back to having the old kind of interview.
You mentioned in the book that you write something on that notebook whenever you start an interview.
Yeah.
Tell everyone about that.
Well, if you looked at my notebook, you'd find SU is what Harold is talking, means shut up, because I talk too much. And, silence can be a great weapon. If you ask someone a question and they don't want to answer it, if you can just shut up, they may feel the need to fill that silence by telling you what you want to know.
And Bob talks about this technique of waiting for it as like May Gray cleaning his pipe.
Yes.
Yeah, that's what he does to get the criminal to confess.
Yeah, because he doesn't want to talk.
Right.
So instead he cleans his pipe. Yeah.
Right. Or
George
Simenon,
in Le Carré, polishes his when he's interrogating someone.
Smiley. Yeah.
George Smiley. He polishes his glasses. He takes off his glasses and polishes them with his necktie. Yeah.
And gets the goods.
Well.
Right. I showed Bob upstairs. We have a re-election poster of FDR's from 1936, which every Democratic elected official signed. And in the corner is Lyndon Johnson's signature, which he no doubt, we surmise, right? He added in 1937 when he was elected to Congress in a special election. And our guess is came to the White House for his great meeting with LBJ, which is a famous photograph, like Clinton meeting Kennedy. And I don't know, we imagine he said, why is my name on that poster? Why is my name not on that poster? And someone must have said, because you weren't elected, maybe. You weren't serving, and he added his name.
Yeah.
So that's in character, right? I want to give people in the audience some time to ask questions of Robert Caro. So I'm going to pause, and who has a question? Right there. The microphone is with you.
Yes, sir.
Would you consider Robert Moses a sociopath? And
I'm
is
sorry?
there any? Would you consider Robert Moses a sociopath? And is there any significance to where he's buried?
What was the last part of that?
He was I'm under the impression he was buried in Woodlawn in the Bronx, and I always thought that was a strange place for him to be buried, since a lot of his monuments are on Long Island.
Did you say he was buried in the Bronx?
In Woodlawn.
No, he's not buried in the Bronx. He's buried in Bayshore, Long Island. But your other question about whether he's a sociopath, I don't know what a sociopath. I don't use psychological definitions like that. He was a man with a great vision on a vast scale and a vast determination to build the things he wanted to build, and an absolute disregard for anyone who stood in his way, except that if you stood in his way too long, he would destroy you or would try to destroy you.
We have a question here.
Mr. Caro, my question is about working.
Yes.
And the way in which technology seems to be turning many of us into people with much less patience than we used to have, and how, as a scholar of and an author and a student of these subjects of political power, do you ever think about the way in which that might change our ability to understand political power in the future?
Yeah, that's a terrific question, to which I really, things are changing. The Obama presidential library is going to have no paper in it. It's going to be completely digitized. I mean, I'm not suggesting. I just do things the way I do them. I don't say that they're the right way to do things. I'm not even sure that they are, but it's the way I was taught, as Harold's questions at the beginning, it's the way I was taught to do them, you know. And I think you do find things, if you just say, I'm going to turn every page, you know, you do suddenly come across things that you never thought would be there, or that no one else thought would be there, and they explain things. So now there's this vast, you know, at the Johnson Library, they keep finding new, and I don't mean they're concealing them. There are 45 million pieces of paper. They keep I'm writing about Vietnam now. They keep finding whole new sections of papers on Vietnam that nobody really knew was there. So I don't believe we've actually found or they've actually found all the papers yet. And you know, it's like each bunch of papers casts new light. You know, you say each time. The last time I said, when they told me, I said, well, how many pages are we talking about here? I think they said 2,300, 2,000. I said, just Xerox them and send them up, because I didn't want to go back again. Yeah, so technology is changing things.
And digitized records are not the same. I
In
mean,
the first place, what nobody says in all the discussions about the Obama presidency and this library is someone has to decide what is digitized. Exactly. I don't want anyone deciding what I can look at.
and also, I mean, from my experience in the Lincoln Papers, which are now inaccessible to almost all historians, you can read the papers on the Library of Congress website, but you can't see the notes that Lincoln made or the things he clipped and put in the files unless you have access to the originals, which I worry no one will have. And I'm sure this is the issue with the Obama records, as you say, it depends on who's doing the digitizing and what's being included and omitted.
Yes.
Which is
exactly
a potential loss. Right there in the back row.
Do you see Lyndon Johnson's sort of quest for power and achievement of his quest for power as an extension of insecurity on his part, or as the actions of a sort of a supremely confident man?
Well, let me say, as I say, I don't try to psychoanalyze him. He had a great insecurity, so I spend a lot of time showing why he was insecure, this horrible boyhood that he had, really terrible, where his father was the most respected man in Johnson City. He was a representative who passed a number of really terrific populist laws, and he was the most successful businessman in Johnson City, and suddenly he makes one mistake. They lose the Johnson Ranch, and then during that time, Lyndon Johnson idolizes his father. He tries to dress like him, walk like him, loves his father, if we want to use that word. Suddenly the father makes one mistake, and his life is ruined. The Johnsons lose the Johnson Ranch. Lyndon Johnson spends the rest of his boyhood in this little house in Johnson City that every month they're afraid the bank is going to take away from them. In fact, there's often no food in the house, and neighbors have to bring charity. And his father becomes the laughing stock of Johnson City. So you really say, well, you understand why someone would be insecure. You understand from different things what drove him, this incredible determination, this incredible aggressiveness, which is, I mean, Harold, I don't even think Harold, I mean, Lyndon Johnson just came along and signed this document 18 months after the document had been put together and everyone else had signed it. I mean, so I'm not sure I understand, I try to show all the things that went into making Lyndon Johnson the way he was, including his compassion. When seeing him teaching, he has to drop out of school, as you know, for a year to earn enough money to keep on in colleges. He teaches in what was called the Mexican school down in this little town of Cotulla in Texas. And after learning about that, I wrote, no teacher had ever cared if these kids learned or not. This teacher cared. And you say these are strains that you see throughout his whole life, from his youth to the end of his life. And they are consistent, if very contrasting strains. I don't know that I would call them anything specific like insecurity or something.
There's someone who I'm dying to recognize who is sort of way in the back there. Who's got the mic? All right, we'll do this and then we'll go further back.
Okay, thank you. Hi, Mr. Caro.
Hi.
Hi, I just want to say your writing has been a life experience for me, and it's really the North Star as I set out to research and write my late father's biography. And I could go on and on like everyone else in this room, but I'll try to SU and reel it in. But I was really excited to hear that you have the desire to write your own memoir. And I was wondering, is it natural for us to anticipate that you would apply the same comprehensively investigative approach towards documenting your own life? Or do you think that what you've written so far already sufficiently represents that part of you? And also, what if someone wanted to biograph the biographer, and how would you feel about other people coming forth to write your story?
Great questions.
The last one was, how would I feel about someone coming to write my story?
Yeah.
Uneasy. The question before that was,
Will you apply the same rigor to
to the
unraveling
memoir?
your story?
Actually, I'm trying. I'm writing a longer memoir, and actually, I'm not sure. I am trying to include everything. Yeah.
Okay, this gentleman way in the back. There we go.
Hi, Mr. Carroll. I want to know how Lyndon Johnson was able to accomplish cutting out those yearbooks pages and not being discovered.
How did Johnson manage to excise the yearbook pages? Do you have a clue?
Yeah, actually, that's quite a story. It's in the first volume. He had made the one of his techniques, which he would later use with Franklin Roosevelt and Sam Rayburn, is to make an older man really regard himself as father figure. And he did this with the college president. And the college president had the deans, actually, 2 deans, and I found the 2 deans who cut out the pages. Yeah.
Right here. And then when you're done, you can just hand it back.
Okay. 2 sort of short questions. You talked about that you're writing about Vietnam now. Have you traveled there yet?
No.
Okay.
No.
Do you have an idea of how long you plan to spend there? I would anticipate probably not the 3 years you spent in the Hill Country, but how long you plan to spend there?
No, I really don't. You know, you never know how long it's going to take. I didn't realize it was going to take 3 years. We would have to live in the Hill Country for 3 years. Although it's not a have to. We came to really, that was sort of a great adventure for us learning this new. But I have no idea how long I have to stay there.
And I've heard you mention Al Smith as a figure of the past that you would have liked to have, written about. Who's a potentially maybe a more modern figure, either elected or not elected, that if you had the opportunity, you would have liked to have covered or written a biography of?
Well, I don't know that there is. I like to write about people who changed the world, and how they did it through political power. Franklin Roosevelt certainly did that. Lyndon Johnson did that. I'm not actually sure when you look. I don't know the answer. I'm not saying I'm not actually sure when you look back at America in the 20th, 21st centuries that we're going to see anyone who really changed the country to the extent that I don't know the answer to that, but I don't know any. Can't think of anyone right now.
Hello? Hey, Mr. Carroll. My question is, in the interview, Sorry, I'm over here.
Oh, sorry. Sorry.
Okay. In the interview, in the back of the book, there's a part where you talk about trying to put forth the impact of some of these buildings or the scale of some of these endeavors that either one of those subjects put forth. And you came up with the idea of the list, and then you edit the list into a rhythmic pattern. So when I was reading that, I was wondering if there were influences outside of literature that you draw on when you think about rhythm, because you started to talk about rhythm and the idea of how words work together and how that's very important. So be it music or maybe poetry.
Good. So what rhythmic examples in literature do?
Well,
inspire
as
you?
this gentleman knows, what he's talking about is when I'm writing the Moses book, I had my first editor was this encouraging gentleman who kept saying to me, nobody's going to read a book on Robert Moses, Therefore, you can't have the other half of your advance. But I said, I have to do something to show the importance of the immensity of what he's done. And what you're talking about is, it's one thing to say he built 627 miles of expressways or parkways. That doesn't do it, And then I said, well, I'll list all the, and then I put all the names down. Said, that's not doing it. Then I thought of, you said in literature, I thought of a specific thing. I thought of Homer's Iliad. You say, what makes, you have this great image of all the nations coming, sending their ships. And how does he do that? He lists the nations and he lists the ships. And you say, but there's a rhythm in how he does it. You can't tear your eyes away from the page, at least I can. I said, I wonder if there's a way to put the names of these roads into a rhythm. So it took forever, to tell you the truth. But what you see in the book is the closest that I could come to that.
Amazing. Gail, somebody have a mic? I think I can do it. No, you need the mic. We're recording this.
What was the question in the 7th interview with Robert Moses that so offended him?
Good question.
Can you all hear that?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, here's what happened. So I'm looking, if you know the Northern State Parkway, you know that it curves in two different places. It drops down about 3 miles before it comes back to its original route. So then I found his original maps, which had it running as a straight line. So I said, well, what made him curve it? So the easternmost curve, I found by looking through Franklin Roosevelt's gubernatorial papers, actually. What happened was the legislature, which was controlled by the robber barons who controlled the North Shore, didn't want this road. So they were not giving him money, the Long Island State Park Commission, not him personally, they were not giving the Long Island State Park Commission any appropriations, even for survey. So he was stopped. So the original route was supposed to run through the private 18-hole golf course of a Wall Street financier named Otto Kahn. And Kahn said to Moses that he would give the Long Island State Park Commission $10,000 for surveys, if the surveys found a route around his estate. So I had found this out, but I was very carefully tried to word the question to get into this topic. But Robert Moses was a lot smarter than I was. As soon as the words Otto Kahn came out of my mouth in whatever innocuous way I had surrounded it, I saw his eyes change. And just a little while after that, he said, well, that'll be enough for today. And I never got to see him again.
I want to give everyone time to go upstairs and join us for a reception and give you all the opportunity to get a signed copy of the book. So I am reluctantly going to cut it short, but with one more anecdote. Bob tells in the book that when Moses made it difficult for him to do research in this dark, labyrinthine place where files were kept by the Parks Department. I guess the Parks Department employees were cautioned to not make things easy for Bob and Ina Caro. So when they went out for lunch, they would take out the light bulbs, right? And after a while, Bob and Ina would come with their own lunch and with their own light bulbs. So, I mean, that's an illustration of, to quote what you wrote about Lyndon Johnson, about how you've brought us the light. There's no one like you. As long as it takes for the final volume of Lyndon Johnson to appear, we will be there to be illuminated and to cheer. I think you would have been Mae West's favorite author. You know, Mae West said, "I love a man who takes his time." And, you know, with what you've given us, every wait is worth it. Bob Caro, you are the best, and I'm so honored that you came to Roosevelt.